Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're tackling one of the biggest mysteries in history, the late Bronze Age collapse.
Ah, yes. It's a period that's captivated historians and archaeologists for centuries.
So picture this, around 1200 BC, seemingly unstoppable civilizations across the Mediterranean just crumbled. We're talking the Egyptians, the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, all gone or drastically weakened.
It really is as if the ancient world's internet just went dark.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Trade routes that had thrived for centuries just vanish. We see evidence of widespread destruction, abandoned cities. It's a puzzle with so many pieces.
And what's fascinating is that this wasn't a gradual decline. It was a rapid collapse, relatively speaking, happening over just a few decades.
Right, a few decades for something that had been around for centuries. For this deep dive, we've got a couple of sources to guide us, mainly Wikipedia and some lectures by Eric Klein. He's like the leading expert on this whole late Bronze Age collapse thing.
Yeah, Klein's work has been really influential in shaping our understanding of this period. His book is even called 1177 BC, the year civilization collapsed.
Although I think he'd be the first to admit that it wasn't literally a single year.
Oh, definitely. It was a process, but his work helps us understand the different threads of this mystery.
So for years, historians blamed those mysterious sea peoples who seemed to appear out of nowhere and cause chaos across the Mediterranean. It's a story that's always captured the imagination.
Oh, absolutely. But Kleinlein and others argue that the sea peoples were more of a symptom than the actual cause.
So more like a catalyst than the root cause.
Exactly. Kleinlein compares them to the Dust Bowl migrants in the 1930s, people driven to desperate measures by environmental catastrophe.
So are we talking about entire populations displaced by some kind of catastrophe and forced to migrate, becoming both victims and aggressors as they sought survival?
Exactly. Kleinlein sees them as both victims and agents of destruction. Their arrival certainly added to the chaos, but they were a product of larger forces at play.
And what were these larger forces that set the stage for this perfect storm?
Well, Klein argues that climate change was the most likely trigger.
Climate change back then.
Yes, studies of things like stalagmites and lake sediments show a massive drought lasting for decades.
Wow, for decades.
Yes, impacting a huge area from Italy to Iran, and this happened right when the collapse was taking place.
So imagine a drought so severe that it cripples agriculture, leads to famine, social unrest, and mass migrations. And then boom, the sea peoples arrive, adding fuel to the fire.
It really was a perfect storm scenario. But here's where things get really interesting. Even with all these challenges, Klein argues that some societies might have survived if they had been more adaptable.
So some civilizations had the tools to weather the storm but didn't use them.
Yeah.
What made the difference between those who thrived and those who crumbled?
That's where we start to see some fascinating contrasts. Some civilizations, like the Phoenicians and Cypriots, actually flourished after the collapse.
Really flourished.
Yes, they were what we might call anti-fragile.
Anti-fragile. I like that. What does that mean in this context?
It means that they didn't just bounce back, they actually got stronger because of the challenges they faced.
So how did they pull that off? What was their secret weapon?
Adaptability. The Phoenicians were already renowned seafarers, and they saw the collapse as an opportunity to expand their trade networks.
So while others were struggling, they were out there sailing the seas, making new connections.
Exactly. And they didn't just focus on trade, they also standardized the alphabet, making it easier to learn and use.
The alphabet we use today.
Yes, the version they developed ultimately became the basis for the Greek and Latin alphabets, which influenced writing systems all over the world.
So they left behind quite a legacy. But the Phoenicians weren't the only innovators. The Cypriots also faced a major crisis. They were running out of copper, the key ingredient for bronze.
Right, and this forced them to innovate. They mastered ironworking, which was much more difficult but proved essential for the transition to the Iron Age.
So they turned a shortage into a technological revolution.
Exactly. And what's remarkable is that they didn't hoard this knowledge. They spread it through trade and migration, helping to lay the foundation for a new era.
It's amazing how they turn crisis into opportunity. Now, before we explore how other civilizations fared, there's one fascinating detail from Klein's work that I have to ask about.
Oh, you're talking about the tomb robbing in ancient Egypt.
Exactly. It seems the Egyptians were so worried about looters during this chaotic period that they went to extraordinary lengths to protect their pharaoh's mummies.
They were playing musical tombs, moving the mummies from one tomb to another to keep them safe from grave robbers.
It sounds like something out of an Indiana Jones movie. But how do we know this actually happened?
Well, the Egyptians left us records. They documented these reburials, describing the damage to the tombs, the repairs they made, and the rituals they perform.
Wow. So we have firsthand accounts of this ancient game of hide-and-seek with pharaohs.
It's incredible. It shows how archaeology isn't just about digging up artifacts. It's about piecing together a story using all the evidence we have.
And sometimes that evidence tells a very surprising story, like pharaohs being moved from tomb to tomb to keep them safe from looters. Okay, so we've got these adaptable, innovative civilizations like the Phoenicians and Cypriots, but what about those who weren't so lucky? What happened to them?
Well, as I said, it was a mixed bag. Some civilizations vanished, others barely survived, and some managed to adapt and even thrive.
Let's start with those who didn't fare so well. The Hittites, for example, they were a major power in Anatolia.
The Hittites are a classic example of a civilization that seemed to vanish almost overnight. Their empire collapsed, their capital city was destroyed, and their language and culture pretty much disappeared.
Wow, that's a stark contrast to the Phoenicians and Cypriots. What made the Hittites so vulnerable?
Well, the drought and famine certainly played a part, but there were also internal factors at play, like political instability and perhaps a weakening of their central authority.
So a combination of external pressures and internal weaknesses. It's like a 1-2 punch.
Exactly. And the Hittites weren't alone. The Mycenaeans, the civilization we associate with the Trojan War and those epic tales, also went through a major decline.
So what happened to them? Did they disappear like the Hittites?
Well, their story is a bit more complicated. We see evidence of destruction, a decline in trade, and a much simpler material culture.
So their civilization became less sophisticated.
Exactly. But unlike the Hittites, they didn't completely vanish. Their culture survived, though in a much reduced form, and their language, an early form of Greek, eventually evolved into the Greek we know today.
So they were like a phoenix rising from the ashes, but maybe with fewer feathers.
That's a good analogy, and it raises the question of what caused their decline. Was it the legendary Dorian invasion?
Ah, yes, the Dorian invasion. I've always been fascinated by that story. These fierce warriors sweeping down from the north, conquering the Mycenaeans. It sounds like something straight out of Homer.
It does, doesn't it? But Klein argues that there's very little evidence to support this invasion theory. He calls it a mirage.
A mirage, meaning it's more myth than reality.
Exactly. He suggests that the Mycenaean decline was more likely due to a combination of factors: the drought, the disruption of trade, and internal conflicts.
So those same pressures that we saw with the Hittites.
Exactly. But the Mycenaeans were already showing signs of stress before the collapse. There's evidence of overexploitation of resources and growing social inequality.
So it was like they were already on shaky ground, and then these external shocks came along and pushed them over the edge. It's a reminder that even powerful civilizations can be vulnerable if they don't address their underlying problems.
Absolutely. And it brings us to another region that was hit hard by the collapse: the southern Levant, the area that includes present-day Israel, Palestine, Jordan, and Lebanon.
So what happened there? Was it total devastation?
Well, it was certainly a time of great upheaval. We see cities being destroyed, the population declining, and settlements shifting.
So a major reshaping of the cultural landscape.
Exactly. The powerful Canaanite city-states were replaced by smaller, less complex societies.
But even amidst this chaos, were there any glimmers of hope, any signs of resilience?
Oh, absolutely. Even in the darkest of times, you find people adapting and finding ways to survive. Klein talks about how new groups, like the Philistines, emerged from the wreckage and carved out new identities for themselves.
The Philistines. Aren't they usually portrayed as the bad guys in the biblical stories about the ancient Israelites?
They are, but their story is much more complex than that. They were actually one of the sea peoples who settled along the coast of the southern Levant.
So they were part of that wave of migration that swept across the Mediterranean.
Exactly. And they brought with them new technologies and cultural practices, like their distinctive pottery style.
So they weren't just passively absorbing the existing culture, they were actively shaping it, bringing in new ideas and ways of doing things.
Precisely. And this shows that collapse doesn't always mean the end. It can also be a time of new beginnings.
So it's a historical remix, blending the old with the new to create something fresh and vibrant. Okay, so we've talked about the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, and the people of the southern Levant. But what about the big players? The Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, do they just fade away?
Not quite. Their stories are a bit more complex.
So they managed to hang on.
In a way, yes. The Egyptians survived, but never regained their former glory. They retreated from the international scene, their economies stagnated, and they faced internal strife.
So they were weakened but not broken.
Exactly, like a wounded lion licking its wounds. But the Assyrians and Babylonians are an interesting case. They actually proved quite resilient.
Really? So they weathered the storm?
They did. They maintained their writing systems, their administrative structures, and their cultural traditions, laying the groundwork for a resurgence of power in the centuries that followed.
So they were playing the long game, waiting for the right moment to reassert themselves.
Precisely. It's a reminder that collapse doesn't always mean annihilation. Sometimes it's a period of transformation, a time to regroup, reassess, and rebuild.
Like hitting the reset button. A chance to learn from past mistakes and create a more resilient future.
Exactly. And that brings us to another fascinating point that Clotilde raises about the archaeological record.
Oh, you're talking about the tomb robbing in ancient Egypt.
Yes, Egyptologists were puzzled by pharaohs' mummies found in the wrong tombs. It turns out that tomb robbing was so rampant during the collapse and the following centuries that the Egyptians had to move their pharaohs' mummies to protect them.
Wait, so they were playing musical tunes with their most sacred relics. That's incredible.
It is, and we know this because they documented these reburials. They described the damage to the tombs, the repairs, and the rituals involved.
It's amazing how these records bring the past to life. It's not just about dry facts and figures. It's about real people making tough choices in chaotic times.
Exactly. And it highlights a crucial point. The archaeological record isn't always what it seems. We need to consider all the evidence to understand what truly happened.
So it's like piecing together a puzzle where some pieces are missing and others have been moved around. We need to look at everything the archaeological finds, the written records, and the scientific data.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And when we do that, we start to see the connections between climate change, social unrest, migration, invasion, and ultimately collapse.
It's a complex tapestry with many threads woven together.
Exactly. But it offers valuable lessons for our own time. Lessons about the fragility of civilizations and the importance of adaptability, innovation, and social cohesion.
And that's what makes this deep dive so important. We're not just uncovering the past, we're gaining insights into the present.
Exactly. So join us in part 2, where we'll explore the aftermath of the collapse and see how these civilizations rebuilt, transformed, and ultimately shaped the world we know today.
It's a story of resilience, innovation, and the enduring human spirit. So last time we were talking about how some civilizations, like the Assyrians and Babylonians, actually managed to weather the storm and even set the stage for future empires.
They did. It's remarkable.
But I'm curious about those who didn't fare so well. What happened to, like, the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, those in the southern Levant?
Well, that's where the story gets a bit darker. The Hittites, who were a major power in Anatolia, basically vanished.
Vanished.
Yeah, their empire just disintegrated, their capital city was destroyed, their language and their culture almost completely disappeared.
Wow, that's a pretty complete collapse. What led to such a dramatic downfall? Was it all external pressures, or were there internal problems too?
It seems to have been a combination of factors, as is often the case in these complex situations. The drought and the famine definitely played a role, weakening their economy and causing unrest. But there's also evidence that they had internal struggles, like power struggles among the elites, and maybe even a weakening of their central government.
So it's like everything was falling apart from the inside and the outside, kind of a double whammy.
Exactly. The Hittites weren't the only ones facing these challenges. The Mycenaeans, the civilization we associate with the Trojan War and those epic Greek stories, they also went through a major decline.
Oh yeah, the Mycenaeans. What happened to them? Did they disappear completely, like the Hittites?
Well, the Mycenaean collapse is a bit of a puzzle. We see evidence of destruction, a decline in trade, and their material culture, the stuff they left behind, it becomes much simpler.
And so it's like their civilization became less sophisticated.
Yeah, exactly. But unlike the Hittites, they didn't completely vanish. Their culture survived, but in a much smaller, less grand form. And their language, which was an early form of Greek, eventually evolved into the Greek we know today.
So they were kind of like a phoenix rising from the ashes,
Yeah.
but maybe with a few less feathers.
I like that analogy. It's a good one. It raises the question, though, of what caused their decline. Was it the Dorian invasion?
Oh, yeah, the Dorian invasion. I always think about that story, these fierce warriors sweeping down from the north and conquering the Mycenaeans. It sounds like something straight out of Homer.
It does, doesn't it? But Klein argues that there's very little evidence to actually support this invasion theory.
Really?
He calls it a mirage.
A mirage. So more like a historical legend than a historical fact.
Exactly. He suggests that the Mycenaean decline was more likely due to a combination of factors, similar to what happened with the Hittites, the drought, the disruption of trade networks, and those internal conflicts.
Those same pressures that we saw with the Hittites.
Exactly. And the Mycenaeans were already showing signs of stress before the collapse, overexploiting resources, growing inequality within their society.
It's like they were already pushing their system to the limit, and then these external shocks just kind of tipped them over the edge.
Exactly. It's a reminder that even seemingly powerful civilizations can be vulnerable if they're not addressing those underlying issues. But we've been talking about Anatolia and Greece. What about the southern Levant?
Oh, yeah, the southern Levant. That's right.
Well,
the area that includes present-day Israel, Palestine, Jordan, and Lebanon. What was going on over there?
the southern Levant was also hit pretty hard by the late Bronze Age collapse. We see cities being destroyed, the population declining, and a change in how people were living, where they were settling.
So a major reshaping of the cultural landscape.
Exactly. The powerful Canaanite city-states, the ones that have been so successful during the Bronze Age, they were replaced by smaller, less complex societies.
So a real downsizing.
Yeah, pretty much. But even in all this destruction and chaos, were there any bright spots, anyone who managed to adapt or even thrive?
I hope so.
There were. Even in the darkest times, you find people adapting and finding new ways to survive. Klein talks about how some groups, like the Philistines, emerged from the wreckage and made new identities for themselves.
The Philistines. That's interesting. I always think of them as kind of the bad guys in the biblical stories.
Right. They're often portrayed as the antagonists, but their history is much more nuanced than that. They were actually one of the sea peoples who settled along the coast of the southern Levant.
Really? So they were part of that wave of migration that swept across the Mediterranean.
Exactly. And they brought with them new technologies, new ways of doing things, and a distinct pottery style.
So they weren't just passively adopting what was already there. They were actively shaping the culture, adding new elements and ideas.
Precisely. And it shows that collapse doesn't always mean the end. It can also be a time of new beginnings.
A historical remix, blending the old and the new to create something fresh and different.
I like that. Okay, so we've talked about the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, and the people of the southern Levant. What about those big empires, the Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians? What happened to them?
Yeah, they were major players in the Bronze Age.
They were. And their stories are pretty fascinating.
So they didn't just disappear.
No, not exactly. The Egyptians survived, but they never really regained their former glory. They kind of retreated from the international scene, their economy stagnated, and they had a lot of internal strife.
So weakened but not completely broken?
Exactly, like a wounded lion licking its wounds. But the Assyrians and the Babylonians, they're a really interesting case. They actually proved to be quite resilient.
Resilient. How so?
Well, they managed to hold on to their writing systems, their administrative structures, and their cultural traditions. They laid the groundwork for a resurgence of power in the centuries that followed.
So they were kind of like biding their time, waiting for the right moment to make a comeback.
Exactly. It's a reminder that collapse doesn't always mean the end. Sometimes it's just a transformation, a chance to regroup, reassess, and rebuild.
Like hitting the reset button, a chance to learn from past mistakes and build something better.
Exactly. And that brings us to another fascinating aspect of the collapse that Klein emphasizes.
What's that?
The way it challenges our understanding of the archaeological record.
Oh, you're talking about the tomb robbing in ancient Egypt.
Exactly. Egyptologists were initially puzzled by finding pharaohs' mummies in the wrong tombs, not where they were supposed to be.
Yeah.
It turns out that tomb robbing was so common during and after the collapse that the Egyptians had to move those mummies to protect them.
Wow, so they were playing musical tunes with their pharaohs.
Pretty much. And we know this because they actually documented these reburials.
Really?
Yeah, they described the damage to the tombs, the repairs they made, and even the rituals they performed.
That's amazing. It's like we have these firsthand accounts of this ancient game of hide and seek with pharaohs.
It really is incredible. And it just shows how archaeology isn't just about digging things up. It's about using all the evidence we have to piece together the story.
And sometimes the evidence tells a really unexpected story. So we've seen how some civilizations vanished, others barely survived, and some actually thrived during this period.
It's a complex picture with a lot of different outcomes.
What can we learn from this collapse? Is there a way to avoid making the same mistakes?
Well, that's what we'll explore in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, so welcome back for the final part of our deep dive into the late Bronze Age collapse. We've covered a lot of ground over the past two parts, from those mysterious sea peoples to drought-stricken empires, crumbling palaces, and those who managed to survive and even thrive.
It's been quite a journey.
It really has. And we've seen how this period wasn't just about destruction and decline. It was also a time of incredible resilience, innovation, and transformation.
Absolutely.
But I want to shift our focus now to the lessons we can learn from all this. It's easy to get caught up in the doom and gloom of civilizations collapsing. But I think there's also a message of hope here, a sense that by understanding the past, we can maybe avoid repeating the same mistakes.
I completely agree. One of Flyn's main points is that studying history isn't about trying to predict the future. It's about understanding patterns of human behavior, the forces that shape societies, and the choices that lead to certain outcomes.
Okay, so let's get practical. What were some of the big red flags those Bronze Age civilizations might missed? What are the warning signs we should be looking for in our own world?
Well, one of the key factors is interconnectedness. As we discussed, the Bronze Age world was very interconnected through trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange.
Right.
Now, that had a lot of benefits, like economic prosperity, sharing of knowledge, and spreading new ideas. But it also meant that a crisis in one part of the world could quickly cascade and affect distant regions.
Like a domino effect.
Exactly. One civilization falls, and it triggers a chain reaction that can bring down others. So in our own superconnected world, what can we do to prevent these kinds of cascading failures?
That's the million-dollar question.
Klein suggests that diversification is key. You see, if we rely too heavily on just one source of energy or one trading partner or one system of governance, we make ourselves very vulnerable to any disruptions.
So like not putting all your eggs in one basket.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Spreading the risk, having backups, building redundancy into the system, that's essential for building resilience.
And this applies not just to like physical systems, but also to our social and political structures too.
Right. Absolutely. Societies that are diverse, inclusive, and adaptable, they're much better equipped to handle crises than those that are rigid, hierarchical, and homogenous.
So basically, embracing diversity, fostering tolerance, and promoting dialogue are not just nice to haves. They're essential for survival in our complex and interconnected world.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Okay, so we've talked about interconnectedness, diversity, and adaptability. But there's another big one. We can't ignore climate change.
Oh, absolutely. That was a major factor in the late Bronze Age collapse, and it's something we can't afford to overlook today.
But the Bronze Age civilizations didn't have the scientific knowledge or the technology to understand and address climate change.
They didn't. We do. We have no excuse.
Yeah, we have the knowledge. The question is, will we act on it?
Exactly. Ignoring the science, delaying action, prioritizing short-term gains over long-term sustainability, it's a recipe for disaster.
So we need to transition to renewable energy, reduce our impact on the environment, and create a more sustainable future.
Couldn't agree more.
So we've got interconnectedness, diversity, adaptability, sustainability, and I feel like there's one more big lesson here. The ability to learn from the past.
You're absolutely right. The Bronze Age collapse shows us that even the most powerful civilizations are not invincible. They can and do collapse, often for reasons that are complex, but ultimately preventable.
So studying history isn't just about memorizing names and dates. It's about understanding human nature, the forces that shape our world, and learning from those who came before us.
Exactly. It's about recognizing the patterns and the choices that lead to certain outcomes.
And that brings us back to Klein's thought-provoking question. Are we, with all our advancements, wise enough to learn from the past and avoid making the same mistakes?
It's a question we all need to ask ourselves.
Because ultimately, the future isn't predetermined. It's shaped by the choices we make, the actions we take, and the lessons we learn.
I think that's a perfect note to end on.
I agree. So keep learning, keep questioning, and keep striving to create a future that learns from the mistakes of the past.
Well said.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the late Bronze Age collapse. We'll see you next time for another fascinating exploration of history and what it can teach us about ourselves and the world we live in.